door had no handle. Nadia Dumont had been staring at it for 40 seconds, which felt like 40 years, because the archive behind that door was allegedly sealed by blood law older than any nation on this earth. And yet the lock had dissolved the moment she had spoken her own name aloud into the dark corridor beneath the Lazarescu. Estate. Not a password, not a command, her name. Her specific, unremarkable, entirely human name, which meant someone had put it there for her. I would not open that door. The voice came from directly behind her, low and controlled with the particular stillness of something that had not needed to breathe for centuries. Whatever you believe you need inside that room, the cost of knowing it will not leave you unchanged. Nadia did not turn around. She had learned in 4 months of teaching private history seminars to the vampire court of Emeric Lazarescu that turning around too quickly made you look afraid, and being afraid in this corridor was the single most dangerous thing she could be right now. You told me, she said carefully, that the archive predated your dynasty. You said no human had ever been permitted inside it. You said you did not know what key would ever open it. She pressed her fingertips flat against the cold black door. The surface felt like compressed silence, and yet, here we are. So either you lied to me, Emeric, or someone lied to both of us, and I need to know which. The silence behind her was enormous. Then she heard him move, and that was the terrifying part, because Emeric Lazarescu did not make sound when he moved, unless he chose to, and he was choosing to now, letting her hear every deliberate step, so she would know he was closing the distance between them before his voice arrived low and steady against the back of her neck. Turn around, Nadia. She turned. He was exactly as she had first seen him 4 months ago in the marble lobby of Meridian International Academy, where she had been a visiting lecturer in pre-industrial European history, and he had arrived at the front desk asking specifically for her by name, with an offer so financially absurd she had almost called the police instead. White hair swept back from a face that would have been beautiful if it did not carry the precise weight of 8 centuries behind the eyes. Pale as quarried stone, tall and angular in a charcoal suit that cost more than her car, with hands that looked gentle, until you noticed how precisely still they could become when he was calculating something. He was calculating something right now. The archive was sealed by my grandfather, he said, and the word grandfather, spoken by something that had existed since the 13th century, landed in the air between them with strange and heavy gravity, not with a key, not with blood, and not with any law I have ever been able to locate in the Covenant records. He sealed it with a voice, Nadia, a specific human voice, he paused, a voice that no living person should have possessed. But I do, she said, but you do. They stood in the subterranean corridor, 60 feet beneath the streets of Vienna, in a passage that did not appear on any architectural record of the building above it, and Nadia watched the most powerful vampire sovereign in Central Europe look at her with something that was not calculation anymore. It was older than that. It was grief. Tell me, she said quietly. Tell me everything before we open it. He looked at the door. He looked at her, and for the first time in 4 months, Emeric Lazarescu sat down on the cold stone floor of an underground corridor and began to talk. Nadia had arrived in Vienna in October with 2 suitcases, a doctorate in early modern European history, and a teaching contract that her department chair had told her was, quote, almost certainly a money laundering operation. She had laughed at him. Then she had taken the contract anyway, because the Lazarescu stipend was enough to clear her entire graduate school debt and fund 3 years of independent research. and she had been 29 years old and exhausted and deeply tired of being cautious. The estate was not what she expected. She had expected something theatrical, something performatively Gothic, the kind of staged atmosphere that very rich people, with too much time, sometimes constructed for entertainment. What she found instead was a working intellectual court. 43 vampires ranging in apparent age from late teens to old age, all of them formally educated, most of them fluent in 4 or more languages, every one of them with a specific area of scholarly interest and a tutor they had engaged over the centuries to keep their knowledge current. Nadia's role was to teach pre-industrial European history to a group of 12 who had actually lived through most of it and needed, as Emeric had explained during her first meeting with him, not instruction in the events themselves, but in the interpretation of those events as they appeared to the humans who had survived them. "You want to understand," she had said at that first meeting, sitting across a desk from him in a study lined with originals that any museum on the continent would have wept for, "how your history looks from the outside. I want to understand," he had corrected, with the measured precision that she was already beginning to recognize as his resting mode of speech. Why the outside remembers it so differently than I do. That had been the beginning of everything. The seminars were extraordinary. Not because teaching vampires who had witnessed the Black Death and the Reformation and the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire was inherently simple, because it was not, but because the conversation that resulted from it was unlike anything Nadia had ever experienced in a classroom, they argued. They corrected her sources, sometimes accurately, sometimes with the particular arrogance of people who had been in the room and still got things wrong because proximity is not objectivity. They showed her original documents she had previously known only from tertiary citations. They remembered the smell of specific cities in specific decades and argued about whether the smell meant poverty or trade growth. And those arguments were the most genuinely alive academic debates she had ever participated in. Emeric did not attend most of the seminars. He was the sovereign. He had a court to govern, a network of political relationships that spanned 6 countries and 4 centuries of accumulated obligation, and a very large pile of things that required his direct authority. He knew this because he had told her so with the blunt matter-of-factness that she had come to realize was not coldness, but was in fact a kind of respect. He did not perform busyness to seem important. He was simply busy and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. He had attended the 7th seminar. She had been discussing the 17th century witch trial records of Transylvania, which was relevant to the court's regional history, and she had argued something that apparently no vampire scholar in 800 years had thought to say aloud, that the human villages during those trials had not been targeting vampires specifically. They had been targeting anyone whose prosperity deviated too far from the communal average, and vampires simply happened to fit the pattern. The silence, after she said it was the kind that meant something had shifted. Emeric had been standing in the doorway. She had not known he was there until the silence told her to look. "Explain that," he had said, not as a command but as something that sounded almost urgent. She had explained it. He had sat down. He had stayed for 3 hours. He had asked questions that were not academic, but were instead something more naked than that, the questions of someone who had carried an old wound for a very long time and was not sure whether the information he was receiving would heal it or reopen it. After the seminar, When everyone else had left, he had looked at her for a long moment and said, "In 8 centuries, no one has ever offered me that interpretation. Probably because most of your advisors are vampires," she had said reasonably, "and most of your human employees are here professionally, not academically, and you are here academically. I am here because you are the most extraordinary primary source I have ever encountered," she said honestly, "and you hired me to help you understand your own history, which means I have to tell you things that are true even when they are inconvenient." He had looked at her for a very long moment. Then something in the careful stillness of his face had shifted, very slightly, and he had said, "Yes, that is precisely what I need you to do." That had been November. By December, they were meeting privately 3 evenings a week, not for seminars, but for conversations that moved across centuries, the way other people's conversations moved across dinner topics. She had learned the geography of his history, the courts he had built and lost, the alliances that had held for generations and the ones that had shattered in a single night, the blood laws he governed under, and the ancient vow that bound every sovereign of his line to a covenant of non-interference in human governance they found both morally correct and occasionally maddening. He had learned the geography of hers, the small town in southern France where she had grown up, the grandmother who had taught her to read from antique maps, the failed engagement to a man who wanted her to be smaller than she was, the dissertation that had taken 6 years and made her the kind of historian who argued with primary sources out loud in empty archives. He had laughed at that last one. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it had been brief and genuine, and it had undone something in her chest that she had not been prepared for. January had been the most dangerous month. Not because anything had happened, because everything had been about to, and both of them knew it, and neither of them had moved, because the distance between a vampire sovereign and his human historian was not merely a matter of species. It was a matter of law. She had learned this from Valeska, the court's senior archivist, who had been 340 years old and had the particular directness of someone who had outlived every polite social convention she had ever encountered. You understand that the blood law prohibits formal bonding with a human unless the human is declared under sovereign protection? Valeska had said one afternoon, not looking up from the manuscript she was cataloguing. And sovereign protection requires a council vote, and a council vote requires public acknowledgement. And public acknowledgement is what Emeric has been avoiding. Because there are 3 factions in this court who would use any vulnerability they could find, and a human woman he is visibly attached to is exactly the kind of vulnerability they have been waiting for. Nadia had been quiet for a moment. "Has he said anything to the council?" "He does not need to say anything to the council," Valeska had said, finally looking up with eyes the color of old copper. "Every vampire in this building already knows. The question is what he intends to do about it. And the more pressing question, Nadia, is what you intend to do." She had not answered that question, but she had thought about it every night since. Lying in the apartment above the estate's east wing that had been fitted with both a state-of-the-art security system and windows with UV-resistant glass, the latter of which she had been told was standard, but which she suspected was specific to her. February had brought the messenger. He had arrived at the estate's public entrance on a Tuesday afternoon, which was already unusual because the court's communications did not come through public entrances. He was very old, and he smelled of courts older than Emeric's, and he carried a sealed envelope that he delivered directly to Nadia, not to Emeric. With the particular loaded courtesy of someone delivering a warning dressed as an invitation, the envelope contained a single line of text. The archive remembers what the king has forgotten. Speak your name at the 3rd basement door and learn what you were hired to discover. She had not told Emeric about the envelope. She was not proud of this. She had told herself she needed to verify the claim first, that walking into the basement at night without telling anyone was a perfectly reasonable investigative decision, that she was a historian, and this was a primary source question, and she was entirely in control of the situation. She had been absolutely wrong about all of it, and she had opened the door with her name, and Emeric had died in the corridor 20 seconds later with the expression of someone who had been watching a person he cared about walk toward a very specific kind of danger and had decided that stopping them entirely was worse than letting them reach the edge of it first. Which meant he had known she was here, which meant he had let her come. "You knew about the envelope," she said, sitting beside him on the cold corridor floor now. Because if he was going to be on the floor, she was going to be on the floor, and because the height differential was unnecessary. "You knew someone sent it to me." "I intercepted a copy," he said. "The original went to you intact. I chose not to intercept it." "Why?" He was quiet. His profile in the corridor's low light was all clean angles and old patience. "Because you would have found the door eventually. You are the kind of person who finds every door, Nadia. And I had begun to believe that you finding this one was not an accident. Whose voice did your grandfather use to seal it?" He was quiet for a very long time, long enough that the silence began to feel like a living thing between them. "Her name was Nadia Dumont," he said. The name hit her like cold water. "She was a cartographer," Emeric continued, and his voice had gone to something she had not heard before, something careful and ancient and sad. Human. Brilliant. She worked in Paris in the early 18th century, and she mapped territories that did not appear on any official record, because they were territories belonging to vampire courts who needed accurate geography for reasons that the human world was not permitted to know. My grandfather hired her the same way I hired you, for her expertise, for her particular and irreplaceable perspective. Nadia's mouth was very dry. "She is my ancestor. She was your ancestor in the direct maternal line." He said, "I confirmed this in December. Your grandmother's family name was Dumont before marriage. The cartographic records in the archive include her personal journals, her correspondence with my grandfather, and a sealed covenant she entered with him that I have never been able to read." He paused. "The covenant bears a locking inscription that says, in the diplomatic language of that period, that it opens for the voice that carries her blood forward." Nadia stood up. She stood up because she needed to be upright for what she was about to feel, and what she was about to feel was large and complicated, and it needed room. "You hired me," she said, "knowing I was her descendant." "I hired you," he said, standing too, "because you are the finest historian I have encountered in 40 years of looking, and because your work on pre-industrial vampire-human economic interaction is the most accurate scholarship I have ever read from a human author, and because, yes, I knew your family name before I contacted your department, and I knew what it might mean, and you did not tell me I did not tell you," he agreed, "because I did not know what the archive contained, and because I was afraid that if I told you, you would believe that your presence here was purely instrumental, that I had hired a Dumont in order to open a door." He met her eyes. And what she saw in his was not the careful calculation she had learned to read over 4 months, but something rawer than that. I hired a Nadia Dumont. The door was secondary. I need you to understand that, she breathed. The cold air of the corridor tasted like old stone and something faintly metallic, and the particular charged pressure of something that had been held back for a very long time. Open it with me, she said. Nadia, I am not asking you to send me in alone. I am asking you to come with me. Whatever is in there, we look at it together. She held out her hand. You have been alone with your history for 8 centuries, Emeric. I am asking you to stop. He looked at her hand, he looked at her face, and then Emeric Lazarescu, who had governed a sovereign court through the Napoleonic restructuring and 2 world wars and the entire digital revolution, took her hand, and they opened the door. The archive was not what she expected, which seemed to be a recurring theme with this estate. She had expected something medieval, something dust-laden and decaying. What she found was a room that had been maintained with extraordinary care, lit by fixtures that had been updated across the centuries to match whatever technology was currently filled with the clean blue light of LED strips installed in the ceiling. The shelves were organized. The manuscripts were in archival sleeves. The room smelled of preservation, not decay. At the center of the room was a single reading table with 2 chairs. 2 chairs, waiting. Nadia felt something move through her that she could not name. Your grandfather expected this moment. It appears so, Emeric said, and his voice was not entirely steady. On the table was a sealed document box with a second locking inscription that dissolved as Nadia's fingers touched it. Inside were 3 items, a set of maps in an unmistakable 18th century hand, a journal bound in deep blue leather, and a letter sealed with wax, bearing both the Lazarescu crest and a cartographer's compass. Rose Nadia opened the letter. The handwriting side shifted, as if 2 people had written it together, or as if one person had begun it and another had continued. She read it aloud because it felt like the right thing to do, because the room had been built for her voice, and she was going to use it. The letter described a covenant made in Paris in 1711 between Céline Dumont, cartographer, and Emeric Lazarescu, vampire sovereign. That was not a professional agreement, and not a blood contract, but something the letter called a truth compact, an arrangement in which a human scholar and a vampire court pledged mutual transparency across bloodlines, with the promise that when the line of each came to stand in the same threshold again, the compact would be renewed or dissolved, according to the truth they found between them. The compact, the letter said, had been sealed with devotion rather than blood, because devotion, Aldrich had written in the second half of the letter, in a hand that Emeric clearly recognized, lasts longer than any oath. And because Céline had told me that a lock made of love is one that only love can open, Nadia set the letter down. She was crying very quietly, and she did not particularly care. He loved her, she said. Your grandfather loved Céline. Yes, Emeric said, and the word was rough. Did she? The journal? He said. Her journal. I have never been able to read it. I think it answers that. She opened the journal. The first entry was dated March 1711, the last dated December 1718, and Nadia read enough of it in the first few minutes to understand what it contained. She read it for an hour, sitting at the table in the chair that had been waiting for her, while Emeric sat in the chair beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she told him what she read because his eyes could not process the 18th century French script as quickly as hers, and because she wanted him to have this, Celine Dumont had loved Emeric Lazarescu. She had loved him knowingly, without illusion about what he was or what the world would allow them. And she had built him maps of territories that kept his courts safe, and he had protected her and her family with the full force of his sovereign authority for the 7 years they had together. She had died in December 1718 of a fever, and the last entry in the journal was not written by Celine but by Aldrich, a single paragraph in imperfect French that described what it felt like to sit with someone's last hours and know that his immortality was not a gift but a cruelty, because it meant he would carry every hour of her after she was gone. Nadia closed the journal. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "He built this room for them," she finally said. "He preserved her work, her journals, her letters, and he sealed it with the one thing he knew would eventually find its way back here, a voice like hers." He was not a patient man in most things, Emeric said, and his voice was rough with something ancient, but in some things he was willing to wait as long as it took. Nadia turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. "You said the compact could be renewed or dissolved according to the truth found between us," she said. "Yes. What truth have you found, Emeric?" He was very still. But this was different from his usual stillness, the calculating kind. This was the stillness of someone who had reached the end of every careful distance they had maintained, and found that the distance no longer served them. "I found," he said, "that in 4 months you have made me see my own history more clearly than I have in 800 years. I found that every conversation I have with you ends with something in me that had been closed for a very long time standing open. I found that the 3 factions in my court who want to use you as a weapon against me are entirely correct, that you are the most significant vulnerability I have developed in a century. And I find that I am entirely unwilling to address that vulnerability by removing you from my life." He paused. "What I am trying to say, Nadia, is that I am in love with you. And I have been since November, and the reason I did not tell you is because the moment I tell you, the court becomes dangerous for you in ways I cannot fully mitigate." Nadia looked at him for a very long moment. "Tell me about the danger," she said. "Specifically, all of it, no more protected ignorance." His expression shifted into something that was almost relief. "There are 3 court factions with standing grievances against my governance. Seraphil, who believes the sovereign title should have passed to a different line 4 centuries ago. Mordecai, who has been building an alliance with the Eastern courts, specifically to challenge my treaty positions. And Vilaine, who is the most dangerous of the 3, because she is not ideological. She is simply ambitious, and she has been looking for a human leverage point for 30 years. He met her eyes. "If I declare sovereign protection over you, which is the only legal mechanism that gives you court standing and full safety, it requires public acknowledgement of the bond. Public acknowledgement hands Seraphil, Mordecai, and Vilaine a very clear announcement that you matter to me and things I care about can be threatened," she said. "Or taken," he said, and the word was quiet, but it landed like a stone in still water. Nadia was quiet for a moment, thinking. She was very good at thinking under pressure. It was one of the things her ex-fiancé had hated about her, and one of the things she valued most about herself. "Valescas told me that declaring sovereign protection requires a council vote," she said. "Does the council vote in open session?" "Yes, so there is no private route to protection. There is one," he said, "an ancient vow older than the council structure. In the early centuries of vampire governance, before councils were formalized, a sovereign could declare an irrevocable personal bond under what the old codes called the blood witness law. It supersedes council jurisdiction entirely. It was used historically in cases of war and exile and extreme court instability. He paused. It was not designed for situations like ours, but it would work. He said, it would also be irreversible, and it would require me to stand before the full court and declare you under my personal protection in terms that every vampire in the building would understand as a sovereign announcement of intention. It would provoke exactly the confrontation I have been trying to prevent. You have been trying to prevent a confrontation, Nadia said, by keeping the tension in a state of indefinite non-resolution, which means the factions have had months to build their positions while you have not moved. She tilted her head. That is not a strategy, Emeric. That is a delay. He looked at her. Something passed through his expression that was entirely unguarded. You are, he said, the only person in 8 centuries who has ever told me I am wrong without flinching. You are also, she said, the only person who has ever created a problem this complicated for me and remained someone I wanted to help solve it. She reached across the archive table and covered his hand with hers. The skin of his hand was cool and smooth and entirely still under her touch, and then it was not still, because he turned his hand over and held hers with a kind of careful and total attention that she had only previously seen him give to things he was absolutely certain he was not going to lose. If I invoke blood witness law tomorrow, he said, the court will convene. There will be a challenge from at least one of the 3 factions, possibly all of them. The challenge will be ugly. I have sat in tenure committee meetings, she said. I can handle ugly. Nadia, he said very softly, this is not a committee meeting. I know, she said, but I am not going to let you face it alone, and I am not going to pretend I am too fragile to stand in a vampire court and be told I do not belong there. I belong wherever I choose to stand, and I am choosing this. She looked at him steadily. Am I choosing correctly? Because if you do not want this, if the archive and Celine's journal and this whole extraordinary evening has somehow not been enough for you to be certain, tell me now, and I will walk out of this room and never mention it again. He stood. He stood, and he was very tall in the low light, and his white hair was silver-edged in the archive's blue glow. And he looked at her with 8 centuries of solitary history and the particular quality of a person who had just decided to stop being alone. I want this, he said. I have wanted this since November, and I want it now, and will want it in ways I cannot fully articulate yet, because I am a great deal older than my vocabulary for certain things. But I want you to stay, Nadia, not because of Celine, not because of the compact, not because of any ancient vow, because you are you and I am me, and something between us is extraordinary, and I am not willing to let political caution make me into a coward. She stood up to meet him. Then tomorrow we handle the court. Tomorrow, he agreed. And the word was a promise. That night, for the first time, Nadia did not return to the apartment in the East Wing alone. She sat beside Emeric in the archive until 3 in the morning, reading Celine's maps with him, tracing the geography of a century she knew academically, and he knew personally, and the conversation they had was so alive and layered and honest that she lost track of the time entirely. And when they finally left the archive and walked back through the corridor to the upper levels of the estate, he kept her hand in his, and they walked through his home together like people who had made a decision. Which they had. The next morning, Nadia dressed in the most deliberate outfit she owned. Dark trousers, a deep green blouse that her grandmother had once told her made her look capable of anything, and the small compass rose, pendant she had worn every day since she was 16, because her grandmother had given it to her from a box of family keepsakes, with the instruction that it had been in their line for a very long time and belonged with her now. She looked at the pendant in the mirror and thought about Céline Dumont in Paris in 1711, drawing maps of territories no one else would acknowledge, and felt something settle in her spine. She went downstairs. Emeric was in the main hall with Valeska, and when Nadia came down the stairs, Valeska looked at her for a long moment, and then looked at Emeric, and then she smiled in the way of someone who has been waiting for the correct thing to happen for a very long time. "Blood witness," Valeska said. "Blood witness," Emeric confirmed. "Seraphil will challenge," Valeska said. "I know Mordecai will second the challenge on procedural grounds. He has been building a case that the ancient vow cannot be invoked outside of documented war conditions. His case is incorrect," Emeric said. "The blood witness law predates the war condition amendment by 4 centuries, and the amendment was never formally incorporated into the base covenant. I know because I was on the council when the amendment was proposed, and I voted against incorporation." Valeska raised her eyebrows. "You were planning for this." "I was planning for the possibility," he said. Since November, she looked at him with her old copper eyes, and something in them was warm. "Good," she said simply, and went back to her work. The court convened at dusk, as was traditional for formal proceedings, in the great hall of the estate's lower level, a room that Nadia had visited during orientation and had catalogued mentally as extraordinary architecture, without fully processing what it was used for. Now she understood. The room held 43 vampires in formal arrangement, with Emeric's governance chair at the head and the full court arrayed in the tiered seating that was old enough to predate every chair currently placed in it. She stood beside Emeric. She was the only human in the room. Seraphil arrived last, as she suspected the challenging faction always did, because drama required a particular timing. He was very old, Seraphil, older than the estate and possibly older than the dynasty, with hair as white as bone and eyes the exact color of winter before the snow, and he looked at Nadia with the practiced contempt of someone who had outlasted every inconvenient thing that had ever crossed his path and fully intended to outlast this one. "A blood witness claim," he said, before Emeric had spoken, "over a human woman who has been in this court for 4 months. He let the number sit in the air like an accusation. You are testing the covenant's patience. I am invoking a right that is documented in the original covenant text," Emeric said, and his voice was the controlled kind of quiet that was significantly more dangerous than anything louder would have been. "My right to invoke it is not contingent on your approval, Seraphil. The law requires that the sovereign demonstrate material vulnerability," Mordecai said, from the left tier, standing smooth and precise in his challenge. He was younger looking than Seraphil, which meant nothing, and impeccably groomed in the way of someone who had been preparing this moment for longer than the seminar program. "An attraction is not a material vulnerability. The law was written for wartime exigency. I moved to challenge the invocation on grounds of misapplication. The base covenant does not specify wartime," Emeric said. "Cite the article." A pause. Mordecai's composure thinned very slightly at the edges. "The war condition was proposed as an amendment in 1887, Emeric continued, addressing not Mordecai but the full court, the particular authority of his voice filling the tiered room with absolute clarity. It was debated for 2 sessions and declined by this council on the grounds that restricting blood witness protection to wartime conditions would reduce the law's applicability to extreme scenarios, while abandoning the original intent, which was to protect any bond that a sovereign declared essential to their governance capacity. The amendment failed. The base text stands. The base text does not require war. My invocation is valid. He looked at Mordecai. Unless you have found an article I have not. Mordecai sat down. Vilaine had not spoken yet, and Nadia was watching her, because the most dangerous of the 3 was the one who had not moved. She was standing at the far end of the left tier with the stillness of someone waiting for the precise moment. It came when Emeric turned to begin the formal declaration. The human is a descendant of a line that previously held a compact with this court, Vilaine said, clearly into the formal silence. The Dumont compact was never dissolved. If it remains active, the blood witness law cannot be invoked over the same lineage, because the prior compact creates a conflict of binding under Article 9 of the Covenant. The room was very quiet. Nadia spoke. The Dumont compact was written with a dissolution clause, she said, and every vampire in the room turned to look at her, which she had expected and was prepared for. Her voice was steady. The clause states that the compact is renewed or dissolved according to the truth found between the lines when they next meet at the same threshold. We opened the archive last night. We read the compact. We found the truth. I am choosing to dissolve the prior compact and stand under sovereign protection through blood witness law. That is my right as the current holder of the Dumont line. Vilaine stared at her. How do you know the dissolution clause? Because I read the original document last night in the archive where it has been preserved for 300 years, Nadia said. I read it aloud. Would you like the specific language? She gave the specific language, word for word, in 18th century French, because she was a historian, and she had read it carefully, and she had an extremely good memory, and she was not going to let this moment be taken from her by a vampire who had arrived prepared for a woman who did not know her own inheritance. The room was silent. Vilaine sat down. Valeska, from her position at the court record table, made a notation with the particular quiet satisfaction of someone recording a historic moment. Emeric looked at Nadia with something so open in his expression that it was almost private, too private for this room, and she looked back at him with everything she felt, which was large and warm and complicated and entirely certain. He completed the declaration. The court acknowledged it. The 3 factions made no further challenge. Afterward, in the corridor outside the great hall, Seraphil stopped them. He was very old, and Nadia had been watching him carefully for an hour, and what she saw was not pure malice, which she had expected, but the more complicated thing, a person who had been fighting a political battle for so long that the battle had become more real to him than any original grievance. You are remarkable, he said to Nadia, and she could not tell if it was a compliment or a warning. Thank you, she said, deciding to take it as a compliment, because taking things as compliments from people who meant them as warnings was a move she had learned in academia, and it worked just as well here. Seraphil looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked at Emeric. Something passed between them that was old and tired and not entirely hostile. Your grandfather would have found this extremely satisfying, Seraphil said, and walked away. The months that followed were the most extraordinary of Nadia's life, and she had had some genuinely extraordinary months. She continued the seminars. The conversations deepened. She began working directly with the archive, cataloguing Celine's maps and journals with the kind of scholarly care that the materials deserved, and as she worked, she began to understand the full scope of what Celine and Aldrich had built together, a system of shared knowledge that had kept the court's territories accurately mapped through nearly a decade of turbulent politics. And the maps were extraordinary, historically precise, cartographically innovative in ways that Celine's contemporaries had not matched. And the reason they were extraordinary was clearly visible in the journals. She had been working with someone who knew the territories from the inside. It was collaboration, full, genuine, equal collaboration between a human and a vampire who trusted each other completely. Nadia wrote 3 academic papers in the spring. 2 of them she attributed to archival sources without specificity. The third one, on the cartographic innovations of an unnamed 18th century French practitioner, she spent a long evening discussing with Emeric, who listened to her describe Celine's work with the attentiveness of someone hearing an ancestor properly honored for the first time. You could name her, Nadia said. The court would prefer the sources remain uncited, he said. I know, but she deserves the credit. He was quiet for a long time. In the court's private record, he said finally. She has always had her name. Every map she made is attributed in full. Nadia Dumont, cartographer, Paris. The record has just never been made available to external scholarship. Could it be? Nadia asked. With the right protections, the right anonymization of anything that would expose court positions. Just the cartographic work, the methodology, the innovation. Her name in an academic record, somewhere other than a sealed archive. He looked at her for a long moment. You want to give her back to history. I want to give her the history she earned, Nadia said. The same history you hired me to help you understand. The outside view. The record that survives. Work with Valeska on what can be released, he said. I trust your judgment on what can be safely attributed. He paused. And Nadia. Thank you. It was a small thing in the scale of everything that had happened, and it was also enormous, and they both knew it. Summer came to Vienna. The estate looked different in summer, the garden levels above the underground courts filled with early evening light, the long northern dusk making the building's exterior glow warmly. Nadia walked those gardens in the evenings with Emeric, who could move through the low summer sun for brief periods at dusk, given his age. The oldest of vampires having accumulated enough tolerance for diffused evening light that the direct incapacitation of midday became less severe. He was careful about it. She was careful about it. They walked in the precise band of twilight, where the light was gold and low, and he could be present, and she thought often about the logistics of a life built across this particular divide. She had thought about the logistics very carefully and very honestly. She was 30 years old. He was 8 centuries. She would age. She would change. The years between them were not a gap but a chasm, and the chasm was not closing. It was widening in one direction by exactly 1 year per year, and she was not naive enough to ignore this. She raised it one evening in June because ignoring it would have been dishonest, and she had promised herself and him that she would be honest. I want to talk about the years, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, so do I. There are options in the vampire world for this, she said carefully. I know there are. Valeska mentioned the partial turn, the extended life compact. I have read the Covenant articles. She paused. I am not bringing this up to pressure you. I am bringing it up because not talking about it is a way of letting it become a problem by omission. The options exist, he said. They are each complex. The partial turn would extend your life significantly, but would change you in ways that I cannot fully predict, and you cannot fully consent to without more information than I have. The Extended Life Compact is a blood law procedure that requires a covenant amendment and has only been performed twice in recorded court history, and both times with mixed results for the human involved. He stopped walking. He turned to face her. What I can tell you is that I have been thinking about this since December, and what I have concluded is that the decision is yours, entirely yours, and that whatever you decide, I will build a life with you that is worth having, for exactly as long as you have it. Nadia looked at him in the gold evening light and felt something in her chest that was the accumulated weight of every conversation they had ever had, every argument and every revelation and every moment in the archive and every evening in the garden, pressing into a single clear and certain point. I love you, she said. That is not a pressure. That is just what is true. He reached out and touched her face with a hand that was entirely steady, which meant he was feeling things that required steadiness to hold. And he said, I know. I love you. That is also just what is true. Then we take the time we need to make the decision correctly, she said. No rushing it, no fear-based timeline. We research it together, same way we research everything, and when we know enough, we decide. Yes, he said, that is exactly right. Summer turned to autumn in September. The court received a diplomatic delegation from the Eastern Alliance that Mordecai had been building, which Nadia observed from the gallery above the formal reception room with Valeska, who narrated the political subtext, the way Nadia narrated historical context to the seminar, which was both illuminating and deeply entertaining. Mordecai has offered them a treaty position that undercuts Emeric's existing agreement with the northern courts, Valeska said quietly. He expects Emeric to either accept the undercut or break the northern agreement to accommodate the eastern terms, which is a forced choice designed to make either option look like weakness. Nadia said, precisely. What is the actual leverage point in the Eastern Alliance's position? Valeska looked at her with the slight surprise of someone being asked a question they had not expected a human to think of. The Eastern Alliance controls the transit routes through 3 mountain territories that the northern courts have been trying to access for 60 years. So if Emeric brokers a direct access agreement between the northern courts and the Eastern Alliance without placing himself in the middle, both parties get what they actually want, and Mordecai's forced choice evaporates. Valeska was quiet for a moment. He cannot broker that directly without the appearance of overreaching his sovereign jurisdiction into Eastern territory. No, Nadia said. But a human academic who had been studying pre-industrial vampire-human economic interaction could propose a collaborative research initiative between the northern and eastern courts that required exactly the kind of geographic access agreement that would establish the transit precedent academically, with full scholarly attribution. She paused. And if that research initiative happened to be funded by the Lazarescu Archive, which is already a recognized independent scholarly resource, it would be entirely separate from direct sovereign negotiation. Valeska stared at her for a long moment, then she went downstairs. 3 weeks later, Nadia was chairing a preliminary meeting between Northern and Eastern court representatives in the estate's seminar room, which she had set up like an academic conference rather than a diplomatic reception, because academic conferences had a different power structure than diplomatic receptions, and she needed the Eastern delegates to feel that they were in a neutral scholarly space rather than a Lazarescu jurisdiction. It worked. The geographic Geschichtlichen had a conversation about historical cartographic records, which Nadia had specifically chosen, because the Eastern Territories had a rich cartographic history that they were very proud of, and she had read every available source on it beforehand, and asked such detailed and genuine questions that both delegations forgot briefly that they were negotiating. The access agreement was signed in October. Mordecai's challenge position evaporated. In November, exactly 1 year after Emeric had attended his first seminar and stayed for 3 hours asking questions about pain and history, Nadia came downstairs in the morning to find the archive door standing open and Emeric inside. With a document on the reading table, she recognized the document type. She had spent enough time in the archive to recognize the covenant's formal bond language at 10 paces. I have had the extended life compact reviewed by 3 independent covenant scholars, Emeric said, without turning around, because he had heard her on the stairs. I have their full assessments, including risk factors, historical outcomes, and the specific procedural modifications I have proposed to address the previous case's complications. I also have Valeska's review, which is more thorough than all 3 combined. He turned. I am not presenting this as a decision. I am presenting it as the information you said you needed to make the decision, when you are ready. Or not. Nadia crossed the room. She sat in the chair that had been waiting for her since 1711, and she read for 2 hours while Emeric sat beside her the way he always sat beside her, close and still and entirely present. The extended life compact was not immortality. It was a covenant of shared longevity, which meant the human partner's lifespan was extended significantly, tied to the vampire partner's life force in a way that was deeply old magic and deeply personal, and it changed nothing about her essential humanity except the rate at which time moved through her. She would age. She would simply age much more slowly, over centuries rather than decades, and she would remain herself, remain human, retain everything that made her her. The risks were real. She read them all. She read the historical cases. She read Valeska's notes in the margins, which were characteristically direct and characteristically thorough, and included the line. The primary failure in previous cases was a sovereign who was not willing to be genuinely changed by the bond. This is not that case. Nadia looked up. Valeska likes me, she said. Valeska has liked approximately 7 people in 340 years, Emeric said. You are one of them. I consider this a significant endorsement. She is right that the previous failures were about sovereign unwillingness, Nadia said. She is right. Emeric agreed. Are you willing? He looked at her steadily. I have been willing since November of last year. I am asking the question of whether you are. Nadia looked at the document. She looked at the archive around her, the maps on the walls. Celine's journal in its archival sleeve, the compass rose on the pendant at her throat. She thought about Celine in Paris in 1711, making the best maps anyone had ever made of territories no one else would acknowledge, and building something with a person across an impossible divide, because the alternative was not living fully. She thought about herself, at 30 years old, holding the history of a woman she was descended from in her hands, in a room that had been built to wait for her, sitting beside a person who had given her the most extraordinary year of her life and was offering her, very carefully and very clearly, more years than she could count. I am willing, she said. He released a breath. It was very quiet and very long, and she realized it was the first time she had heard him do that, release something held, just let it go. "Then we do this correctly," he said, "every step. Together." "Every step," she agreed. The compact ceremony was private, just the two of them and Valeska as witness in the archive, in the room that had been built for exactly this kind of truth. Nadia was not nervous. She was the kind of calm that comes after a long certainty, the stillness of a person who has considered every angle and arrived at the same clear point from every direction. Emeric performed the compact declaration in the old covenant language, which she had learned enough of over the year to follow, and when the formal language was done, he looked at her and said, in simple modern French, because she loved it and it was Celine's language and it felt right. "I have been alone for a very long time, Nadia. I did not know I was until you," she said. "I have been looking for the right door for a very long time. I did not know I would find it underground in Vienna." Valeska, making her notation in the court record, said, without looking up, "This is extremely sentimental, and I am noting it as such in the official record." Nadia laughed. Emeric looked at Valeska with an expression of profound, dry affection that was the most human expression she had ever seen on his face. "Note it," he said. "Note all of it." The court received the news of the compact the following morning. Serafel sent a formal acknowledgement through the court protocol, which was the vampire equivalent of a very restrained but genuine congratulation. Mordecai was silent, which Valeska said was a form of acceptance in his particular dialect of political communication. Vilaine sent flowers, which Nadia found genuinely surprising, until Valeska explained that Vilaine, stripped of the leverage she had been banking on for 3 decades, had apparently decided that if she could not use Nadia as a tool against Emeric, she might as well acknowledge that Nadia was going to be a permanent part of the court's power structure and behave accordingly. "She respects strength," Valeska said. "She always has. She just needed to see it." Life in the estate settled into a rhythm that was warm and complicated and entirely satisfying. Nadia continued the seminars, which had evolved over a year into something closer to a genuine academic program, with external publication under the archive's institutional name and a growing reputation in very specific scholarly circles as the place to go for primary source European history from the medieval period onward. She continued the archival work. She wrote the paper on Nadia Dumont's cartographic innovations, using the language that Emeric and Valeska had approved for external attribution, and the paper was published in a peer-reviewed journal, and cited with the kind of scholarly satisfaction she had been working toward her entire career, except now the work had a dimension that she had never imagined when she had started her doctorate in a fluorescent-lit seminar room 10 years ago. She was also, on alternate Tuesday evenings, learning to read Covenant script because she had decided that if she was going to be part of this world, she was going to be useful in it across all the dimensions she could manage. And Covenant script turned out to be linguistically related to several early medieval Romance languages she already knew, so the learning curve was steep but navigable. Emeric taught her, sitting across the table from her in the archive, with a patience that she recognized as one of the genuine gifts of very long life, the ability to teach without urgency. In December, the Northern and Eastern courts co-hosted a conference in Prague that cited the Lazarescu Archives Research Initiative as the foundation for their new access agreements, and Nadia attended as the archive's representative, which meant she sat in a room with 24 very old vampires and presented cartographic history to them, and every single one of them listened, because she knew what she was talking about, and because she was standing under sovereign protection, and because the access agreements they had just signed were directly traceable to her work. Mordecai attended the conference. Afterward, he found her in the corridor and said, without preamble, "Your geographic access argument was elegant. The academic framing was unnecessary but effective." "Thank you," she said, and she meant it, and she thought she saw him almost smile. Winter in Vienna was cold and beautiful, and the estate was warm in the deep subterranean way of old buildings that had held heat for centuries. Nadia spent Christmas with Emeric in the archive, which had become their place in the specific way that couples develop particular spaces, not because it was warm or particularly comfortable, but because it was theirs, the room that had opened for her voice and held the truth of where they came from. They had dinner at the long reading table, which Emeric had set properly with crystal and candles while she was working in another part of the building, because he had been in the world long enough to understand that the specific materiality of a beautiful setting carries emotional weight, and he was thoughtful in that way, attentive to the details of what made life vivid. She wore the compass rose pendant, and he noticed the way he always noticed the things she carried deliberately. "Celine wore a pendant like that," he said. "It is described in my grandfather's journal. He gave it to her in 1712. Nadia stilled. She looked down at the pendant, the compass rose that her grandmother had pressed into her hands at 16 from a box of family keepsakes, with the instruction that it had been in their line for a very long time. "It was in her line," Nadia said slowly. "Apparently," Emeric said, and the word was soft with something that was wonder rather than surprise. She sat with that for a long moment. The pendant was warm at her throat, which it always was, which she had always assumed was body heat. 300 years, she said. "Through direct maternal descent," he said. As the compact specified, she looked at him. "Your grandfather was very thorough. He was an extraordinary man," Emeric said quietly. "I did not tell him that enough when I had the chance. He was considerably older than I was when he died, and I was still young enough to take the time for granted." This was one of the things she had learned about Emeric over the year, the specific texture of his regrets. They were not melodramatic. They were quiet and specific, and he carried them with the careful attention of someone who had learned over 8 centuries that grief is most useful when it is acknowledged and then put to work. "Tell me about him," she said. He did. He took us about Emeric Lazarescu for 2 hours over the candlelit dinner. Stories she had not heard before, the personal ones, the ones that lived below the formal record that she had been cataloguing in the archive. The stories that made a historical figure into a person. Aldrich's particular laugh, the way he had argued with the specific energy of someone who loved being wrong, because it meant he was learning something. The period in the mid-17th century when he had become obsessed with early astronomy and turned the estate's upper floor into a functional observatory that had not been used for anything else for a decade. The last conversation Emeric had had with him, which had been about legacy and what legacy actually meant when you could not control how you were remembered. He said, Emeric told her, that the only legacy that lasts is the specific truth you managed to tell during your own lifetime, that everything else is interpretation. He was right, Nadia said. That is exactly right. He would have liked you very much, Emeric said. "I already like him very much," she said. "I have been reading his archive for a year." He reached across the table, and she took his hand, and the candles burned steadily in the old room that had been waiting 3 centuries for this specific conversation, and Nadia felt the weight and warmth of it settle into her with the particular quality of belonging, the deep and unargued kind. Spring came. Nadia turned 31 in March, and the court, which she had not expected to make any gesture about this at all, organized something that Valeska described as a small acknowledgement, and which was in fact a dinner for 20 people with flowers, and an archival manuscript that Emeric had professionally restored and rebound as a gift, a 17th century French geography text that she had mentioned once in a seminar as a foundational source for her doctoral research. She had cried about it privately in the archive after everyone left. Then she had come back out and told Emeric that he was objectively very good at gifts. "I have had time to practice," he said. "Please do not reference your age when accepting a compliment," she said. "It is a deflection." He looked at her for a moment. "You are right," he said. "Thank you. Put considerable thought into it." "I know," she said. "That is why I cried." His expression did the thing she had come to love, the very slight, entirely unguarded softening that he could not fully control, and that she had started to think of as the truest version of his face. By summer, the archive had been formally catalogued, and a selection of its materials had been prepared for controlled scholarly access under the archive's institutional framework, which meant that Céline Dumont's work was slowly becoming part of the academic record in a way that was careful and attributed and correct. The compass paper had been cited 11 times in the 6 months since publication. 3 of the citations were in journals where Nadia herself had reviewed past papers, which gave her a professional satisfaction that was genuinely delightful. The court settled. The factions were not dissolved, because courts did not work that way, and factions served purposes that dissolution would not remove. But the particular tension that had characterized the winter and spring receded into something functional and watchable. Seraphil had his positions, and Emeric had his, and they argued them with the vigor of people who had been arguing for centuries and had developed, underneath the argument, a mutual respect that neither would have acknowledged in so many words. Mordecai had redirected his Eastern Alliance work into formal trade treaty negotiation, which was where that kind of political energy was most constructively employed. Vilaine was, as predicted, working within the new power structure with the efficiency of someone who had made an accurate assessment and adjusted accordingly. Nadia remained what she was, a historian and a teacher, and the person who occupied the chair in the archive that had been built for her ancestor. She was also, increasingly, something that did not have a clean title in the court's formal records, but which every vampire in the building understood without needing one. She was the person Emeric trusted most. She was the person whose counsel he sought on questions that were not simply academic, but were about governance, about history repeating, about the patterns in long records that only a person trained to look for patterns could identify. She was his equal in every dimension, that equality could exist between them, which was many, and the dimensions where they were different, where his centuries gave him something she did not have, and her humanity gave her something he could not entirely access. Those dimensions were not deficits. They were the reason the conversation was interesting. She had thought often, in the quiet moments, about what the next decades would look like. The extended life compact was active, time was moving differently against her already. A subtlety she noticed only in small ways, in the way she healed from small injuries slightly faster than she remembered, in the particular quality of her energy at the end of long days. It was not dramatic, it was not transformative. It was quiet, the way all genuine change is quiet. She was still herself. She was entirely herself. She was just a version of herself that had more time than she had expected, which she intended to use well. In August, she went back to France for 2 weeks to see her family, which she had been doing at regular intervals throughout the year. She had told her parents about Emeric in careful stages, starting with the contract and the estate and the work, moving through the months toward the fuller truth as the relationship itself moved, until by Christmas she had been able to call her mother and describe the man she was in love with in terms that were accurate, if not exhaustively complete. Her mother, who was a practical and observant woman, who had once told Nadia that the most important question about any partner was whether they made her more herself or less, had listened to the description and said, "He sounds like someone who has been waiting for a person who would not be intimidated by him." "That is exactly what he is," Nadia had said. "Good," her mother had said. "You have always been precisely the kind of person who refuses to be intimidated by anything." She had brought a set of the Nadia Dumont reproduction maps to France with her. Not the originals, but high-quality reproductions that the archive had produced as part of the scholarly publication process. And she had shown them to her family with the story she could tell, which was not complete, but was true, and her grandmother, who was 87 and sharp as good steel, had looked at the maps for a very long time and then looked at Nadia and said, "These are ours." "Yes," Nadia had said. "You found them," her grandmother said. "I did." Her grandmother had held one of the maps for a long moment, in the specific way of someone recognizing something they had known was real without ever having proof of it. Then she had looked at Nadia with the direct and uncomplicated warmth of someone who had been right about something important for a very long time. "Good girl," she had said simply. Nadia had come back to Vienna in the 2nd week of August, arriving at the estate in the early evening, with her suitcases and the particular feeling of someone who had been away from a home they loved and was now returning to it. Emeric was waiting at the entrance, not formally, not with any protocol, just standing at the door, in the amber summer light, with his white hair catching the last of the evening sun, and his expression carrying every one of the 12 days of her absence, in a way he would never have described, but which was entirely visible to her, because she knew how to read him now. She had learned the cartography of his face the same way Celine had learned the cartography of his grandfather's territories, carefully and with full attention. She walked up the steps to him. "I found the maps," she said. "You said that in your message," he said, and his voice had the particular quality it carried when he was saying something simple in order to be near her. "My grandmother held one of them," she said. "She said they were ours." "They are," he said. "I agree." She looked at him in the amber light. "I love you." I did not say it in any of the messages, because I wanted to say it here. "I know," he said. "I felt it anyway across 12 days and approximately 2,000 kilometers, which I did not previously believe was something I was capable of." He paused. "I appear to have been wrong about my own capabilities on several occasions since meeting you. You should put that in your governance journal," she said seriously. "That is deeply undignified," he said. "It is historically accurate," she said. Which is my professional standard for what belongs in the record? He looked at her for a moment with the open, unguarded thing in his face that she loved most. Then he took her bags from her hands, because he was the most powerful vampire sovereign in Central Europe, and he was also the person who always noticed what she was carrying when her hands were full, and he said, "Come inside. Valeska has been insufferable without your organizational presence in the archive. Is she actually troubled, or is she performing it?" "Both," he said. "She would never admit the first, so she performs the second at volume." Nadia laughed and walked through the door. The estate in the evening was everything it always was. The accumulated weight of centuries and the particular warmth of a place that had been made into a home by the people who cared about it, and she walked through it the way she had been walking through it for almost a year, with the ease of someone who knew every corridor and every door, including the doors underground, including the ones that opened for her voice. She went to the archive that evening, as she almost always did, and she sat at the table in the chair that was hers, and she looked at Celine's maps on the wall, and the journal in its sleeve, and the letter in its frame, and she thought about the long line of things that had had to be exactly as they were for her to be sitting in this room. The cartographer in Paris in 1711, making maps of territories no one else would acknowledge, the pendant in her grandmother's box, the contract so financially absurd her department chair thought it was money laundering, the seventh seminar, the corridor, the door with no handle, her name dissolving a lock. "You are cataloguing again," Emeric said from the doorway. "I am," she said. "I do it mentally. The chain of events, I know it is not academically rigorous, but it is personally satisfying." "The chain of events is sound," he said, crossing the room to sit beside her. "I have run it myself. And it could have gone differently at several points," he said honestly. "If you had been less stubborn about the door, if I had been less willing to let you reach it, if the envelope had been intercepted, if Vilaine had found the dissolution clause before you did," he paused, "if you had been a different kind of person." But I was not," she said. "No," he said, very quietly, "you were exactly yourself, which is the only reason any of this worked." She turned to look at him, this person who had existed for 8 centuries and still managed to surprise her on a regular basis, this person who had waited 300 years for a voice he did not know the name of and had hired the right person entirely on her own merits, and then had the extraordinary experience of discovering that she was also the answer to an older question than either of them had known to ask. "Emeric," she said. "Yes, I want to be here for a very long time." "You will be," he said, and the certainty in his voice was not the certainty of a command or a prediction. It was the certainty of a person who had decided something completely and intended to honor it with everything he had. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The archive was very quiet and very warm, and outside, above them, Vienna moved through its summer evening in the familiar noise of a city that had been a city for long enough to have depth to every sound. She thought about Céline Dumont in Paris, 300 years ago, sitting at a table with a person across every conceivable divide, and making something that lasted. She thought about the maps on the wall, precisely accurate, named and attributed, entered into the record at last. She thought about the compact they had renewed in this room, the truth they had found between them, the door that had opened for her voice alone, and everything it had been waiting to give. She was a historian. She knew better than most people that the record is never complete, that every moment is continuous with the next, that the story of a thing is not separate from the thing itself, but is the thing itself. Accumulated and carried forward, she was also, sitting in the chair that had been built for her, in a room sealed with an ancestor's devotion and opened with her own name, entirely and completely at home. The archive held its warmth. The pendant rested warm at her throat. Emeric held her with the absolute and quiet sureness of someone who had finally stopped waiting. Outside, the city moved. Inside, everything was still. And the record, Nadia thought, was very good.